Picture this. You're a Neanderthal, minding your own business, trying to roast a mammoth steak over a smoky little fire. Life's already tough. Saber-toothed cats lurking in the bushes, freezing winds trying to turn your toes into icicles. And then, whispers start spreading around the camp. Something bigger is out there. Not just another predator with claws and fangs, but something that looks disturbingly like you. A human, only huge. For centuries, myths and legends have told us about giants, towering people who stalk the earth, smashing skulls and occasionally using regular-sized humans as snacks. Sounds ridiculous, right? Except here's the thing. Scattered across fossil sites and archaeological digs, we keep finding evidence of oversized bones, butchered Neanderthals, and some very suspicious cut marks that scream, this was not an accident. So, did giant humans really hunt and eat Neanderthals? Were these towering cannibals flesh and blood predators, or just the product of a few mammoth bones and overactive imaginations? Well, grab your club and keep your fire close, because we're about to dive into one of prehistory's weirdest, creepiest, and most controversial mysteries. Let's be honest, humans love a good tall tale. If there's one universal thing across cultures, it's that somebody, somewhere, has a story about a really big dude smashing things. The Greeks had their cyclopes, one-eyed builders who apparently whipped up temples before breakfast. The Bible gave us Goliath, the guy who learned the hard way that slingshots and foreheads don't mix. Even Native American traditions speak of red-haired giants who terrorized tribes before finally being wiped out. Basically, the idea of giants is as old as campfire storytelling itself. But where did these ideas come from? Because, spoiler alert, giant bone deposits aren't exactly lying around in neat little giant-sized skeletons. What ancient people actually stumbled upon were often mammoth femurs, mastodon teeth, and occasionally the odd cave bear skull. If you've never seen a mastodon molar before, trust me, it looks less like a tooth and more like a chunk of sidewalk. You can see how someone might go, yep, must be a giant's tooth. Probably ate 20 goats for lunch. Fast forward to early European explorers and scientists, and the pattern continues. In the 16th and 17th centuries, reports of giant human skeletons popped up everywhere. Farmers would dig up oversized bones in their fields. Scholars would scratch their beards and nod seriously, and bam, confirmation of ancient giants. Except when modern paleontologists finally checked, most of those giant femurs turned out to be femurs from mammoths, bison, or other Ice Age megafauna. Translation: humans were terrible at bone ID. Still, the myth persisted, because let's face it, giant people eating smaller people makes for a much juicier story than this is just an extinct elephant. Even respected naturalists got caught up in the hype. Some scientists genuinely believed there was once a race of humans twice as tall as us. Newspapers in the 1800s had a field day with this, publishing dramatic illustrations of 15-foot skeletons conveniently lost before anyone else could examine them. Shocker. But here's the twist. It wasn't all imagination. Some real hominins did have giant-like reputations. Enter Homo heidelbergensis, a beefy ancestor of both us and Neanderthals, known for being taller and more robust. And, of course, lurking in the fossil record is Gigantopithecus, a 10-foot-tall ape from Asia that looks suspiciously like the inspiration for every Bigfoot sighting ever. So yeah, while people were mistaking mammoth bones for human shin bones, there were, in fact, some very big primates stomping around the ancient world. The result? Legends, misinterpretations, and a blurry line between mythology and science. People saw giant bones, they saw cannibalism in the archaeological record, and naturally, they combined the two. Because why settle for reality when you can terrify your neighbors with stories of man-eating giants? Okay, so let's ditch the tall tales for a second and talk about the actual candidates, real creatures that could have fueled these giant human legends. Because while 15-foot Goliaths munching on Neanderthals might sound like a bad B-movie plot, There were some hominins and apes in the fossil record that definitely gave off prehistoric linebacker vibes. First up, the celebrity of the giant file, Gigantopithecus blacki. This wasn't some awkward cousin of Homo sapiens, but rather a massive ape that lived in Asia until about 300,000 years ago. Picture an orangutan on steroids standing close to 10 feet tall and weighing around 1,000 pounds. That's basically 3 refrigerators stacked on top of each other, casually chewing bamboo, and yes, it was mostly a gentle giant, a vegetarian snacking on plants rather than Neanderthal ribs. But still, imagine stumbling across one in the Pleistocene forest. No wonder people later whispered about giants. Then we have Homo heidelbergensis, the robust ancestor of both Neanderthals and us. These guys showed up roughly 600,000 years ago and were, well, built. Broad chests, thick bones, and heights reaching over 6 feet at a time when most other hominins were hanging around 5 foot something. Basically, if you lined up early hominins, heidelbergensis would look like the guy who never skips leg day. They hunted big game, worked with fire, and spread widely across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Some scientists even argue that certain populations grew especially tall and stocky, enough to look like giants compared to smaller hominins in the same regions. And here's where it gets interesting. A few Homo sapiens fossils from the Upper Paleolithic period, around 30,000 years ago, also show remarkable height. Some skeletons from Eastern Europe measure well over 6.5 feet tall. Now, that's not NBA tall by today's standards, but when the average Neanderthal was about 5 feet 5 inches, running into a towering human with spears would have felt like meeting a giant. Think of it as a prehistoric David and Goliath moment. Only Goliath had backup and sharper weapons. So we've got Gigantopithecus, too far away and too vegetarian to eat Neanderthals. Homo heidelbergensis, the beefy ancestor who might have occasionally made Neanderthals nervous, and tall Homo sapiens, basically the Amazon Prime version of humans, upgraded and ready to dominate. Were any of these literal giants? Not exactly. But were they big enough to freak out smaller hominins and leave behind stories of man-eaters? Absolutely. And here's the kicker. Fossil evidence shows that Neanderthals were sometimes on the wrong end of violent encounters. Bones with cut marks, skulls smashed in ways that look suspiciously deliberate. Maybe it wasn't mythical 12-foot giants. Maybe it was just larger, stronger groups of humans showing up and deciding Neanderthal dinner was on the menu. Brutal? Yes. Unbelievable? Sadly, no. All right, time to get messy, because if there's one thing Neanderthals left behind besides stone tools and campfire ash, it's bones with, let's call them unfortunate decorations. Turns out cannibalism wasn't just something pulp horror writers dreamed up. Archaeologists have uncovered multiple sites across Europe showing Neanderthals not only got eaten, but sometimes did the eating themselves. Yeah, not exactly family-friendly. Take the Moulagersi cave in France, for example. Excavations there revealed about 100,000-year-old Neanderthal bones covered in cut marks. Not the oops, fell on a rock kind of marks, but the same precise slicing you'd see on butchered deer bones. Long bones had been cracked open to suck out the marrow, skulls were smashed to get at the brain tissue, and even jawbones showed scraping consistent with stripping flesh. In other words, they weren't just killing, this was dinner prep. And Moulagersi wasn't a one-off. At El Sidrón Cave in Spain, researchers uncovered the remains of at least 12 Neanderthals, many of them juveniles with identical signs of butchering. Stone tools were used to dismember bodies, rib cages were cut open, and bones were deliberately broken for marrow. Genetic testing even revealed the group was a family unit, mothers, fathers, children. Which means one of two things. Either starvation forced their neighbors to feast on them, or, brace yourself, it was relatives eating relatives. Yeah. Thanksgiving, but dialed up to nightmare fuel. Why? Well, cannibalism in the prehistoric world usually had two flavors, survival or ritual. In harsh winters, food was scarce, and sometimes the only meat available was the guy next to you. not ideal. But some archaeologists argue there were cultural or symbolic elements too, eating enemies to absorb their strength or practicing rituals involving the body. Unfortunately, bones don't exactly come with sticky notes explaining motive. All we have are the knife marks. And let's not pretend Neanderthals were always the victims here. Evidence suggests they were fully capable of turning the tables. In Belgium's Goyet Cave, Neanderthal bones dating back 40,000 years showed the same butchering treatment as reindeer bones found nearby. Translation, they were on the menu. Whether they were eating enemies, outsiders, or just anyone who looked particularly tender, it's clear Neanderthals didn't always hesitate to chow down on their own kind. Now, before we clutch our pearls, let's put this in perspective. Modern humans have done the same thing throughout history when times got desperate. Donner Party, anyone? The difference is that Neanderthals seem to have left behind lots of these grisly calling cards. Enough that when paired with the legends of giants eating people, you start to see how the stories snowballed. Someone stumbles across butchered Neanderthal bones centuries later, doesn't know what they're looking at, and bam, giants must have eaten them. So yeah, Neanderthal life wasn't just rough, it was occasionally downright horrifying. Between starvation, rival groups, and the occasional episode of Guess Who's for Dinner, it's safe to say being a Neanderthal was not a long-term retirement plan. So here's the million-year-old question. Were Neanderthals really stalked by towering, oversized humans who treated them like walking protein bars? On paper, it sounds absurd, like something ripped from a conspiracy forum. But once you peel back the myths and look at the fossils, the idea isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility. Let's start with the size difference. Neanderthals weren't tiny by any means. They were short, stocky, and incredibly strong. Think compact powerlifters designed to survive Ice Age winters. But Homo sapiens, especially some populations, often ran taller and leaner. Imagine being a Neanderthal, 5'5", barrel-chested, and suddenly a group of 6'2" spear-wielding strangers shows up. That's like showing up to a street fight only to realize you're in the wrong weight class. Then add in the evidence of violence. Multiple Neanderthal skeletons show trauma consistent with close-quarters combat. Skull fractures, broken arms, ribs cracked in ways that don't scream, "Oops, fell off a cliff." Archaeologists have long debated whether these injuries came from hunting accidents, inter-Neanderthal brawls, or run-ins with Homo sapiens. Given that Neanderthals and early modern humans overlapped for thousands of years in Europe and the Middle East, violent encounters weren't just possible, they were inevitable. And when resources got scarce? Well, humans have never exactly been shy about getting creative with their food sources. Here's another wrinkle. Height and strength aside, Homo sapiens had a superweapon, numbers and strategy. Neanderthals lived in small bands, maybe 15 to 30 individuals. Humans, meanwhile, often formed larger groups, coordinating hunts and ambushes. Picture it. A team of taller, faster Homo sapiens cornering a small group of Neanderthals. Spears flying, clubs swinging. Once the dust settles, bones are butchered for marrow. Suddenly, the legend of giants preying on Neanderthals doesn't sound so crazy. It's just a dramatized version of humans being, well, humans. And let's not forget the psychological impact. To a Neanderthal, Homo sapiens weren't just taller, they were weird. Different skull shapes, different tools, maybe even different smells. If a group of larger, unfamiliar hominins repeatedly attacked you and left your kin butchered in caves, of course you'd pass down stories of monstrous giants. Prehistoric gossip was powerful. Now, does that mean there were 12-foot titans stomping around chomping on Neanderthals like chicken wings? But did especially tall and robust Homo sapiens, our prehistoric linebackers, make life miserable for shorter, isolated Neanderthal groups? Highly likely. And given the cannibalism evidence, there's a grim chance they didn't just kill them, they ate them too. So yeah, maybe giant humans weren't mythical at all. They were just us. Taller, stronger versions of us, which honestly makes the story even scarier. Because giants, you can laugh those off as legends, but cannibalistic humans? Those were very, very real. All right, let's fast forward from the Ice Age caves to the age of newspapers and snake oil salesmen, because giants didn't just haunt Neanderthals, they ended up haunting our headlines too. If you've ever scrolled the internet at 3 a.m. and seen claims about suppressed giant skeletons, congratulations, you've stumbled into one of paleontology's favorite urban legends. The story usually goes like this. Farmers in the 1800s dig up a giant human skeleton in some remote American field. Newspapers rush to print drawings of 15-foot-tall men. And then, plot twist, the Smithsonian Institution swoops in, confiscates the bones, and hides them forever. Sounds dramatic, right? Problem is, none of it actually holds up. Every supposed giant skeleton from that era either turned out to be misidentified mastodon bones, badly measured skeletons, or straight-up hoaxes. My personal favorite? The Cardiff Giant, a 10-foot petrified man buried in New York in 1869, which fooled crowds until skeptics noticed the tool marks from carving. Basically, it was a very expensive lawn ornament, and yet people loved it. Giant stories sold newspapers. They boosted museum attendance. They fueled endless sermons about biblical giants, because nothing gets a congregation buzzing like proof of Goliath's cousins buried in Ohio. Even today, the internet is littered with photoshopped giant skeletons dug up by smiling archaeologists. Half of them trace back to a Photoshop contest in the early 2000s. Yep, people are still sharing meme skeletons as undeniable evidence. But why do these myths stick? Simple. Giants explain the unexplainable. Ancient cut-marked bones must have been giants. Oversized femurs from extinct elephants? Definitely giants. Weird gaps in the fossil record? Giants. Humans are storytelling machines, and when the science doesn't immediately make sense, we tend to invent a monster tall enough to fill the hole. And of course, you've got the conspiracy crowd. Some claim that the Smithsonian deliberately destroyed giant skeletons to protect Darwinian evolution. Others suggest shadowy governments don't want us to know the truth about an ancient race of cannibal giants. Because obviously, the best way to keep a secret is to make sure literally everyone on the internet is talking about it. Makes total sense. In reality, paleontologists aren't hiding giant bones. They're just tired of explaining for the 100th time that a mammoth tibia is not proof of a 15-foot caveman. But the myth of the cannibalistic giant persists, now dressed up with clickbait YouTube thumbnails and all-caps titles like "Giants Covered Up by Science." Because let's face it, giants devoured Neanderthals is way catchier than Pleistocene apes were tall. So yeah, no Smithsonian conspiracy, just a bunch of mastodon bones, gullible farmers, and a human obsession with making everything bigger, scarier, and hungrier than it really was. So after all the myths, hoaxes, and exaggerated bedtime stories, what's left when we scrape off the giant-sized fluff? The real story is actually far more brutal and, honestly, far scarier because it doesn't rely on legends. It's about survival, desperation, and the harsh reality of Ice Age life. Spoiler, you didn't need a 12-foot giant to make Neanderthal existence miserable. Regular-sized humans were terrifying enough. Neanderthals lived in some of the harshest environments on Earth: glacial Europe, freezing winters, unpredictable climates where food was often scarce. They were tough, resourceful, and brilliant hunters, but even the best hunters can't magic reindeer out of a snowstorm. When animals were scarce, Neanderthals turned on each other, as we've seen with the butchered bones. Survival trumped sentiment. It wasn't about monsters, it was about calories. And then along came us, Homo sapiens. Taller on average, better organized, and annoyingly good at networking. While Neanderthals tended to stick to small family groups, humans formed larger tribes, shared resources, and coordinated hunts. In a clash between a band of 20 Neanderthals and a tribe of 60 modern humans with better weapons. Yeah, not exactly a fair fight. To Neanderthals, Homo sapiens must have seemed like relentless, invasive predators, giant or not. The archaeological record backs it up. As modern humans spread into Europe about 45,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations began to shrink. It wasn't just violence, it was competition for food, for land, even for mates. Some Neanderthals interbred with us, leaving behind traces in our DNA. Yes, you probably have a bit of Neanderthal in you. But for the most part, they were slowly edged out, starved out, and occasionally, eaten. What makes it darker is that the giant human myth distracts from the uncomfortable truth. The real monsters weren't mythical titans, they were ordinary people, our ancestors, desperate, hungry, ruthless humans who saw no problem cracking open Neanderthal bones for marrow. Forget Bigfoot. Early humans were the ultimate apex predators, capable of turning their closest relatives into lunch without a second thought, and that's the irony. The legends of giants devouring Neanderthals actually do contain a grain of truth, just not in the way people think. Neanderthals were hunted, butchered, and in some cases cannibalized, but the perpetrators weren't mythical giants, they were us. Homo sapiens, armed with sharp stone tools and sharper survival instincts, making sure they came out on top in a brutally competitive world. So maybe there weren't 12-foot man-eaters stomping across Ice Age Europe, but if you were a Neanderthal watching your clan starve while strange, taller humans moved into your valley, well, giants didn't need to exist. You already had something far worse to worry about.